The title of my presentation is Phantom of the Opera, ETFs and Shareholder Voting. And I hope after I basically explain it to you, the title would make much more sense. This is a joint work with Richard Evans, Rabih Moussawi, and Mike Young. In fact, this paper looks at the effect of ETFs on shareholder voting, and you may wonder why it is in this program. In fact, I've been also working on ESG and SRI. I think the connection was very clear in the panel discussion and also the keynote speech. The number one thing is, one of the most important rights, contractual rights of the shareholders is the voting, and this paper essentially is looking at that. And the second issue, as it was discussed among the panelists, is for ESG purposes, for CSR purposes, one of the key tools is engagements, shareholder engagements particularly. And in order to engage meaningfully, you need to have votes in the companies. Otherwise, the CEOs or the management wouldn't necessarily listen to you. And this paper essentially will look at the unintended consequences of ETFs on shareholder voting. I recently got married, and after the marriage, obviously, certain things changed in my life. One of the things that has changed is in my shopping habits. Now I tend to look at the fabrics of the garments I buy, thanks to my wife. Before, I didn't realize that there is such a variety in these fabrics. Apparently, I used to think that when you buy a fabric, it's either 100% wool or cotton. But apparently now the technology has evolved, and now there's a lot of synthetic products within these fabrics. And in fact, the more synthetic it is, the cheaper you would expect it perhaps to be. But more importantly, when there are synthetic fabric involved, it has unintended consequences as well. For instance, it makes you perspire more. Maybe this is obvious to many of you, but this was kind of a new thing for me. Now, how is this related to this paper? Well, in also finance, the new securities that are being developed also have this synthetic structure, and ETFs, these exchange-traded funds, is also one of that element. And it has this unintended consequence that, in fact, what we find in the paper is that because of these shorting of the ETFs, a lot of shares are not voted. Think it like a bit of the metaphor for the perspiration. And how does it work? Let me first, just for those of you who are not really informed on that, ETFs are a hybrid, basically, security between the mutual funds and the real stocks. Let's say if you have an ETF of S&P 500, essentially, by just having this ETF share, you have exposure to the economics, basically cash flows of the underlying 500 stocks. You can also do that through mutual funds. The difference of the ETFs is that you can trade these ETFs like a regular share intraday and with a high liquidity. And ETFs became very popular, particularly for these liquidity reasons and for the ease of basically trading. But basically, this unintended consequence is the shorting of the ETFs. ETFs became particularly popular on the shorting side. And what happens is that when you short the ETF, the mechanism requires, just because of the stability of the financial system, requires that the underlying shares have to be kept in a collateral. Think it that way, that let's say you own an ETF share, and I want to basically borrow it and then short sell it to someone else. In this mechanism, the institution that facilitates this shorting is going to basically keep a collateral. This could be cash, or this could be underlying securities. The whole problem, what I refer to, these unintended consequences of the ETFs, starts from this collateral part, or the hedging part, if you like, that these shares that are kept in the collateral apparently are not voted. This is kind of what we find in the paper. Basically, we introduce a novel measure, what we call the phantom shares. And the whole logic of the phantom shares is just to look at what is the real shares that are being traded versus what is these basically the hoax, the conceptual shares that are traded in the market. Let's go back to the same example I was giving to you. Imagine you have an ETF share, and that is backed by the underlying securities. There is one ETF share and one owner and the underlying shares. Everything matches. But then the moment that I borrow and short it, now there will be two owners to the cash flow, but there is still only one underlying security. If you continue shorting that security, say to another person, this is called rehypothecation, then the system will generate another basically share, ETF share. There will be this time three owners to the cash flow rights, but still there is only one underlying security that's attached to the voting rights. Essentially, you're decoupling the cash flow rights from the voting rights. And what we find in the ETF market is shares could be shorted up to 8 times. And this is huge. Now, what it means is basically for a given company, for the underlying companies, let's say if there are 10,000 shares that are basically underlying, there could be 80,000 shareholders that have exposure to that cash flow. But there is only 10,000 votes to begin with. Therefore, when we take the difference between 80,000 and the 10,000, we call this basically the 70, that has been created 70,000 phantom shares. These are the shares that give access to the cash flow rights in a synthetic way, but it doesn't give you the access to the voting rights. Obviously, without the slides, it's a bit difficult, but I hope at least the intuition gets clear. So far, so good? Okay, now we created these phantom shares. Ideally, these phantom shares should be basically backed by a collateral or hedged by the market makers or the, if you like, the authorized participants of this market. And if that is the case, then they should be voted like the other shares. But if it is the case, what we are suspecting, that they are just basically kept in these collaterals and they are not voted, then it will distort the shareholder voting. And that's why we call it the phantom of the opera. If you think the shareholder voting as the opera, where the voice is exercised, and basically this ETF shorting is creating this phantom that may cause some menace. What we first document is in the shareholder meetings, the shares voted for and the shares voted against decrease with these phantom shares. Essentially, if a company, just by luck, is covered by an ETF, and that ETF is shorted a lot, then without that company even realizing, being victim of this, in its shareholder meetings, the shares of that company are not voted. And this is not about whether the proposal is about for or against. It's simply, basically, these shares disappear in terms of voting. And when we look at another concept called the broker non-votes, these are basically the brokers that are not allowed to vote or they don't vote, we find an increase in the broker non-votes attached to phantom shares. This is basically confirming our conjecture that these shares that are held in the collateral, the underlying security that are held in the collateral or as a hedge, are not voted. Just to do some sort of sanity checks, we did check how the real ETF owners and their underlying shares are voted. Everything looks fine. If the ETF shareholders are voting it for, the number of for shares go up. If the ETF shares are voting against, the number of against shares going down. The same for the other basically index mutual funds. Essentially, we control for any plausible things that we can think of, and this is not driven with some sort of a quirky mechanical issue. As a next step, basically the main finding, and this is the big takeaway from this, is ETF shorting is causing shareholder votes to be locked in and not voted. Okay, that's, if you like, the big message from this paper. The quantity of the votes go down. The next thing that we were interested in is then, okay, if that is the case, do we see any impact on the price of the vote? And I happen to have another paper that has already been published, which measures the value of vote. When John Kay was mentioning about these contractual rights, these are all very valuable. Everybody knows they are valuable, but how valuable they are? I came up with a way to measure it. I can basically measure the value of a vote of any company at any time, as long as they have options traded. And the logic of that, again, just the intuition, by using options, the derivative securities, one can synthesize an underlying security, but that synthetic security will only have the cash flow rights. It will not have the voting rights. If I can make the analogy, if you buy a cola, real cola, versus Cola Zero or Cola Light, and they can do all sorts of advertisements saying that they taste the same. They don't taste the same. Cola tastes much better than Cola Zero. That's the same idea that, when you have the security, it comes with a bundle of a lot of rights. The most important being the cash flow rights, obviously, and that's what all the business schools are worried about. And the pricing of everything is just a discounted cash flows. That's a very simplification. In fact, the value of a security is the value of all these contractual rights. And the second thing that comes in mind is right to vote. If I can again make this analogy, so that because without the slides, perhaps this is the easy way to keep in mind, we are indoctrinated to learn about these shareholders, the securities, the price of the securities, as if they are like an Americano coffee. It's discounted cash flows being coffee. Securities are like cappuccino. Yes, mostly they are cash flows, the coffee, but there is a foam on top, which is very delicious. And the more heat you give to that, the more fight you have on the contractual rights, the more valuable it will be, and that's the value of the vote. And the way I basically disentangle these two things is I use options, as I said, and using the derivatives, you can just replicate the cash flow side, but not the voting rights. Therefore, the difference gives you the value of the vote. Anyway, coming back to our story, what I basically find is that using that measure and then combining with these phantom shares that is unintendedly created using the shorting mechanism, the number of the votes that are voted for or against decrease. And since the quantity decrease, what we find is, in fact, in these critical votes, the price of the vote goes up. It's like a very simple idea of like when the supply is down of the votes, the price of the votes go up. Another thing interesting we check is a change in the regulation in the US in 2010. Before that, this is obviously related to all the scandals. Before that, the brokers could just vote any non-routine items. Basically, in a shareholder meeting, if there's an important issue, the way it works is the shareholders tell their brokers how their shares should be voted for. But then the question comes, obviously, in life, what if they don't say anything? If they don't say anything, the old rule was the brokers just would vote whatever they deem appropriate. And usually the literature finds that what they deem appropriate is just to go along with the management. Okay? And in 2010, this has changed. They made it a bit more difficult. What they call now is that the brokers can vote on routine items, but they cannot vote on non-routine items and one important distinction of that, the director elections were deemed as a non-routine item. What we find is companies with lots of phantom shares, that means a lot of ETF shorting going on, these broker non-votes increase even more dramatically after 2010. This basically suggests that the system gets even more broken, just because they were trying to do something good, but on the other hand, these ETFs, just because of a huge shorting interest in the ETFs and little quirky in the system that these votes are not necessarily accounted for, it didn't work out really well. In fact, SEC is recently interested in this. I very much welcome each of you that are interested in this topic to check their recent discussions. They have a fantastic term for it. They call it proxy plumbing, because the system is so complex. Have you watched Blue Man Show? Anybody show? This is one of the popular shows that kind of shows how the plumbing system of the world works, where you never know where things go and how. This is exactly how the shareholder voting, as particularly in the US. The votes are not counted properly. There's only one company that basically administers this, which is kind of a monopoly. It's a mess, a total mess. And I do work on the voting issues, but until this paper, I didn't really realize how difficult. Basically, the SEC doesn't even know whether the shares are overvoted or undervoted, and there are cases in both. What basically we are saying is that because of this ETF mechanism, shares are undervoted. And if you are believing that shareholder voting is a very important mechanism for the governance of the firm, this should basically ring some alarm bells. Now, what did you do? I mean, now that we have the measure, it's like we have the hammer, everything looks like a nail to us. We just wanted to check one thing. In fact, two things about the governance. One thing we did is we sorted the companies according to their phantom shares. Again, these are, just to remind you again, the shares that have access to the cash flow rights, but not the voting rights through ETF shorting. The companies with more phantom shares underperform the companies with less phantom shares. And then we wanted to dig deeper into that. We look at merger acquisition announcement effects. There is a very well-known fact that acquiring companies, on average, experience a decline in their shareholder price because, on average, acquisitions are not very good decisions, at least as interpreted from the market reaction. What we find is that, in fact, if a company has a lot of phantom shares, then the announcement effects are even more negative for that company. What's the interpretation? Basically, imagine it's a company that's not well governed, and it wants to do a bad value decreasing acquisition. One way to stop that is the shareholders' pressure. But then if that mechanism is not working well, just because of these ETF shorting and other basically impediments to the voting, then these managers go ahead and then do these value destroying acquisitions. And that's kind of what we find. The icing on the cake, I guess, is we were basically trying to see whether it is this collateral channel that's driving everything. And thank God, in Europe, European Commission did a wonderful questionnaire asking its members, what do they do with the shares that they keep in their collaterals? Do they vote or not? This is exactly the question they ask. And the answer, we don't vote them. We don't vote the shares in collateral, and the reason is that because these are kind of temporary in nature. You know, we are the brokers. We don't really have a kind of a say in the company. We don't want to be involved, and this makes perfect sense. Maybe in all times, because the structure of the system wasn't this complicated. But once you introduce an innovation of ETFs, where now you can buy all these shares very easily, just by buying one share, and then all the underlying shares will come with it in a bundled way, and then you short these things, and then you create these basically unintended phantom shares, suddenly the system breaks, because now, because of a lot of interest in the ETFs, a lot of collaterals will be kept in these boxes. A lot of shares the real shares will be kept as a collateral in the boxes. And since they are not voted, suddenly basically the system gets broken. And the ETFs are getting more and more popular, and we want to basically highlight that this is a very big concern. This will be even a bigger concern when the economy goes basically sour, because people will short these securities even more, or they would like to short these securities more. And remember, control really matters when things are bad. You know, you wouldn't necessarily intervene when things are going well, unless you have your own private reasons. But control really matters when, you know, the ship is sinking, and therefore even now we are documenting that these phantom shares are creating inefficiencies. I can't imagine what would happen if basically this is not fixed, and then these ETFs get bigger and bigger, and then the market somewhat kind of turns sour, then things might get even more complicated. I guess this is the first time I've ever presented without slides. I don't know whether I was successful in communicating my message, and I want to thank you for your attention.